Hello, and welcome to the Health Go Live webinar series. Today's episode is brought to you by your friends at Dario Health. We would like to remind you that the Q&A feature is available, so feel free to send in your questions for our panel throughout the discussion. And with that, I will turn it over to our speakers.
Well, welcome, everybody. I'm really grateful to Health for hosting this event and my fellow panelists. So today's topic is, I think if you're on this webinar, you know, and you probably are a believer that technology and digitally enabled care can really has the potential to be transformative across the healthcare system. And throughout the pandemic, we've seen just a huge explosion from originally, maybe a couple percentage points here and there, people ever having used telemedicine or experienced it to, upwards of 80% of people have had some sort of telehealth visit. So it's here, and we've moved so far beyond so that the innovator, will adopt it because it's cool phase. And now we're into the, okay, early adopters and beyond, double clicking on the fine print. And we're starting to see some barriers crop up and some challenges. And this webinar is about what are the innovators in the ecosystem doing to identify and address those challenges, or those biggest barriers to adoption. So that's my my synopsis on what we're talking about. We, as the three of us, welcome your questions. So please submit questions, and we'll try to take them as we go. And again, so I am Lynette Demers. I work for the Digital Medicine Society. We are a global nonprofit committed to the equitable, ethical, safe, and effective development and deployment of digital medicine. So it's a mouthful, but essentially our dog in the fight is the patient, the provider, getting not just any digital out there, but the digital medicine that matters and that is safe and effective. Turn it over to Alex to introduce himself.
So thanks so much, Lynette. And it's a pleasure to be here today. So thanks everyone for joining us. My name is Alex Condoli, and I lead an effort at Sanofi to launch a digital healthcare business in the US. And we work in collaboration with Dario Health. So Rick, it's probably a good opportunity for me to hand over to you.
Thanks, Alex. I also want to say thank you for everybody joining us today. I'm Rick Anderson. I'm the president of Dario Health, where we're really focused on bringing the consumer-centric focus to digital health in a consolidated platform. So very happy to be here today. Thanks for having us.
Great. Okay, so the way we're going to do this is the three of us came up with the topics and questions we thought were going to be most appealing and important to talk about. And of course, the whole reason we're here is to talk about, like, what are some of the, with consumers really leaning in to the extent that consumers are really willing and interested in receiving this type of care. What are plan sponsors and employers really looking for? Because that is going, we can't just be direct consumer forever, knowing that in order to completely integrate healthcare that is digitized into the system, it really has to be driven also by employers. And so, Rick, you've got a lot of experience. You want to take that question?
Sure, I'm happy to start on that one. I think that, if you look at the various different constituents, there's, slight differences in terms of what they're looking for. But overall, I think people are looking for better access. I think digital health can, provide asynchronous, really focus on the between the provider visit. Historically, we've had, a very provider-centric approach, and especially with chronic conditions, you see your provider once a month, once a quarter. And, I think that people are looking for, how do we support people in between those? How do we support patients? How do we enable those small little behavior changes over a period of time that become bigger changes? And I think that they're looking for a consumer-centric approach that really engages people. I think that's one of the biggest challenges, in not only digital health, but all health, in terms of how do we really engage the patients and move them towards a place where they're managing their disease in a better way. And then really in parallel to that, lowering the costs associated with it. And, we believe that making it easy for the patient through a consumer-centric or a patient-centric approach really enables those goals of, engaging members, providing them with a great experience, improving their clinical outcomes, and then on an overall basis, lowering their costs, which is the ultimate goal.
Oh, totally. I think especially in the chronic diseases, that like ability to, well, engage is the word we use, but have patients involved in being active participants in their care, building the skills, and whether or not they engage with the healthcare system really means how good of a job are we doing at honoring their time, the way they want to receive care, their digital health literacy, all of the above. And I know, Alex, you've led the research in this area at Sanofi, and I'm curious to hear, what your thoughts are about this big topic of engagement, and where we should take that.
Yeah, so I think I guess I would sort of build on some of the comments you've just made, Lynette and Rick, that you've made. I think let's just imagine a world 10 years out, and I don't think any of us should imagine that healthcare will be an experience like it is today. I think our whole communities and ourselves, we all know that technology is at a point of maturity where it should be impacting health more than it is today. And of course, we've had the accelerant of COVID, but that accelerant is just setting the expectation and the understanding that this is a ripe environment for transformation. I think, I think, Rick, you touched on a really important point. When we think about what payer customers are interested in, at least part of what they're needing to solve for is how do they help people get engaged and invested in their health? Because we know that the provider system plays a really critical role in improving health. We know that inputs into the provider system, drugs and devices, are critical to improving the outcomes that people can achieve. But fundamentally, it's the life in between moments, right? It's the choices that you and I make every day that makes a difference to what actually gets attained when we talk about the outcomes of health. And I think that's where engagement, on the one hand, sounds like a very simplistic idea, but then on the other hand, has to be translatable into something meaningful. Engagement that drives behavior change that drives an improvement in health is the formula that we need to convincingly be able to demonstrate to people to be convinced that, we might get engaged in a TikTok platform, but that doesn't mean TikTok's going to improve our health, right? So moving from this idea of a platform which engages to a platform which engages and drives a health benefit, which should be rewarded and incentivized to reward, I think is really, really important. And I must say that, and I'm going to use an example from some of the work that we're doing with Dario to sort of highlight that point. In forming a collaboration, part of what we were interested in trying to do is to bring out the best in what a leading digital therapeutics company brings to the table, and also to synergize that with capabilities that exist on the pharmaceutical side. And we saw that data exploration and evidence generation was a really powerful part of that. And I bring out the topic of data and evidence at this point, because when you think about engagement, having compelling proof points that your engagement drives a beneficial outcome is really important to open the door. And if you do that in a structured way, right, where you've analyzed data that you already sit on, then you know how to work with a payer in order to say, well, now let's translate that into real time, because we have the technology platforms that let us do it real time, but the real-time evaluation of meaningful engagement that drives outcome can't be theoretical. It can't be I think it's this. I think you've got to know what you impact. And in knowing what you impact, you can then work with your customers to help them appreciate where you're having biggest impact on populations that they have biggest need for. So I guess I would sort of say, I think this is a key topic. I think this idea of like demonstrating value, and that demonstration of value starts with engagement, but engagement is not the endpoint which we can be satisfied with. Is a key part of what's going to, help accelerate the innovation and the exploration that we're seeing. There's some initial thoughts, but maybe Rick and Lynette, let me open up and see if you might want to build on any of those themes that I've touched on.
Yeah, Rick, I have thoughts, but I'll turn it to you.
Oh, go ahead, Lynn.
Well, I guess what I was sort of doing a lot of nodding my head, because I just right before this webinar came off a group of folks from Amada Health, Dario Health, 30 Madison, just all the leaders in this field, and we talked about evidence. We talked about how this tremendous body of data that we're sitting on, and that is our exhaust, right, in most of healthcare, can help us not only develop the proof points for, does engagement lead to outcomes that matter, real outcomes, not process. And that's really the beauty of digital, is that it is natively data, and so we can use it. And we can also, what really struck me is, like you said, in real time, understand what populations are engaging and how, and change our approach so that we can have the opportunity to finally get to that sort of health equity piece where we're looking at different populations' needs. So yeah, I mean, for me, this is the opportunity where we have the biggest point of differentiation when we can add digital. We'll get to the barriers in a second. I know we're supposed to start with that, but I thought let's start with like where we can have the biggest change. I went off script already. Rick, pile on.
I mean, really, I would pile on to the idea that data is and outcomes data is really important, both from a clinical perspective and from a cost savings perspective as we go forward. I mean, really, the promise of digital health is the ability to save money in a unique way while engaging people in a unique way. So things like the fact that you can do asynchronous, which you can't do with some other, approaches. You certainly can't do with brick and mortar. Things that, you can do one to many, so you can put things out, but also the ability to personalize and see what the impact of that is at scale with digital, and then measure that and then refactor that much more quickly to be able to improve outcomes. Because, either in traditional systems, you have, we come up with guidelines and then we follow those guidelines, and those guidelines are evidence-based, there's no doubt, but they're evidence-based at a large population level. That's why we use them, because you can generalize them. But when you can do it on a digital basis, you can actually adjust to the way people are responding, what's happening in their lives. And so you can make it much more relevant to people. And then you can look at those outcomes on an individual basis. So not just studies that demonstrate, with high rigor that digital interventions are actually improving, people's lives and saving costs for the payers, but also the ability to say, look, this is attributable to these interventions and attributable to these people. And I know we're going to talk about it probably later, but also enables a whole different level of payment approaches, value-based, concepts that just don't exist when you can't really get to the individual level with that data.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, to your point, you get to the individual level, but you can also improve the cycle time of your learning healthcare system and titrating meds for a patient. That's sort of reducing the cycle time in that asynchronous environment with a data-driven approach. That's huge. I mean, because otherwise you're waiting, what, a quarter, 6 months between visits for specialty care. And I think that's a huge piece that we forget to mention sometimes, that has a significant impact on outcomes. All right, so now we get to I would say barriers, but anything new has barrier because it doesn't automatically slot into our existing system. And Rick, you started to mention payment. That is, the incentives need to be aligned. Otherwise, only the bravest and the people with the most time and energy will plow through that barrier to figure it out, and they do. So tell us a little bit about, so one of the questions we talked about is that sort of existing frameworks, mostly for payment and incentives, but other frameworks that are really causing the frictions for adoption, and what we should do about it. Or what Dario was doing in particular.
You want to begin, Rick?
Nope, go ahead, Al.
Let me start. Yeah, I mean, I think somehow all of us are going to have ideas on the barriers that are currently being faced. I think like let me just call out one starting proposition, right, which I think is something we've touched on thematically. The first thing I'd call out is that, digital technology is at a point of maturity where it can impact health, right? And I just say that as a factual statement that I believe in. The technology will get better, the impact will get better, but it's already there, right? So that's the first thing that I think is really important to sort of say, okay, we've got something that's meaningful and something that fits, right, what our societal expectations are and gaps that exist in healthcare today. I think when we think about barriers, I want to maybe, say that there are barriers at every step. There are payer barriers, there are provider system barriers, there are even like member barriers, right? And so if I just pick up on what I think are some of the important things that we can all work towards improving. When I think about, the payer side, if you accept the proposition that the technology to the point of maturity, it has benefit, it has value, I think one of the things on the payer side that we will no doubt see and that we can support the evolution of over the forthcoming years is a more formalized pathway for evaluating digital healthcare solutions. And that both means clarity on the process that is going to be taken with different payer customers that we're in contact with. And it means clarity on the standards that should be met in order to inform the right decisions being made. And that I think we see today a very high interest in adoption of digital. And I think what we're starting to certainly see is leaders in the methodology of evaluating digital solutions. And as we get more and more broad adoption of those solutions, I think that's going to encourage and accelerate further innovation in this space. So I think that's one thing which I would call out at a payer level, which is a really important barrier that I think we're seeing the trends of evolution for sure, and I think we'll see continual acceleration towards a more mature evaluation pathway and standards. When I just go to the next level and I start thinking about the provider system, one thing that jumps out at me as something really important to solve for. Healthcare as an experience today is highly fragmented. And when we think about adding in new innovations with digital healthcare, we can add to that fragmentation or we can solve that fragmentation. And I think it's really important that there is, over time, moves towards improving fragmentation and not adding to fragmentation, right? And so what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that if you've got dozens of digital health solutions available for a population, and they're already dealing with a fragmented experience of healthcare, and nothing is connected, nothing's communicating with each other, I think we're adding complexity in the pursuit of solving for complexity. And so, the ability to integrate seamlessly over time is going to become, I think, a critical need to be addressed more so than what it is today, in order to really see full scaling and full potential that's going to come with the emergence of digital healthcare. And then I guess I would come down one more layer and I'd start talking about the people that we're all seeking to serve, right? The members of our community who have health problems who can benefit from this. And I think while we might have a greater expectation on having a seamless experience with healthcare through digital platforms, we're also going to have to see the societal expectation increase, right? So that people know that what platforms can they trust? When should they see digital as just another modality to help them hit their health goals, just as they might see a medication or a procedure to do the same thing? I think that societal lifting is also really important, because that's going to help with the traction and pull through. So let me pause there, because I'm sure we can build on this. And I think there are some really interesting questions in the chat that build on some of these themes as well that maybe we can pick up on. But maybe I pause there. I don't know, Rick, if you want to build on any of those themes.
Well, actually, I'll take advantage of one of the questions that's talking about how do you, because I do think that this is a hurdle too, is that what's the difference between a digital therapeutic and digital health? And then, you also have the breakdown in digital therapeutics between non-prescription and prescription digital therapeutics. I think that adoption was not helped, if I can put it this way, by some of the solutions. And there's thousands, maybe tens of thousands at this point, health apps on the App Store, if you go to the Apple App Store or the Google Store. Whereas I think digital therapeutics, what we're trying to drive is the idea that you have to have data that supports what you're saying that you're doing. So, the ability to create that data over a period of time, what sorts of studies are you using? How big are the data sets that you're using to support what you're doing? And I think that the distinguishing between having sort of lived through this, with health plans and watch them go from the idea of, okay, well, it's just a bunch of health apps and they don't really have any clinical relevance. We're not going to cover that. That's just a consumer kind of thing, to the point where I think we're at now, where we're starting to generate data. The data we're generating is getting better. And, how do you decide what is the right level of clinical evidence? And I think that that's going to have to be a consensus over a period of time. I don't think we're going to achieve the pharmaceutical level of evidence, nor do I think that's really appropriate in a digital health context. But it's really a learning experience between, understanding the interactions between those and the benefits that you see over a period of time. And what I've seen, having spent a fair number of years now in the overall healthcare industry, is the fact that even when we're talking about something as an industry, and we're all saying sort of, yeah, it doesn't necessarily drive action until those things become much more embedded and become part of, to Alex's point, sort of the common psyche, behind the folks that are really making these decisions. I think evidence is a key element of that. I think separating digital therapeutics, which we try very hard to do, by the way, is to separate digital therapeutics from digital health, although we're as guilty as anybody about using those terms interchangeably. But the idea is something with evidence.
Mm-hmm. Taking a look at some of the questions in the chat here, just to kind of riff off of some of this. Alex, you mentioned some of the payer side barriers. When I talk to payers about the realm that I work in, which is digitally enabled virtual first care, where there's evidence, it's very, very convincing, and it usually can do the job with the innovators. But the frictions are setting up payment in the system, whether we're talking about traditional fee-for-service that we may not have codes to cover all the important components of care, such as coding, or we may be trying to set up something with that does account for engagement milestones or outcomes milestones that is entirely new. So that newness is one piece. And then the other piece I hear a lot that ties into, both digital therapeutics, new apps, and virtual care is trust. And it's trust across the board. I think the issues in healthcare are always fragmentation and quality and access. But in this new realm, we've got the opportunity to do great good or great harm with data security and privacy issues. And I think that may be sort of the other piece we haven't talked about. Curious what you guys would say other payer side barriers to address that.
From my perspective, I think we spend a lot of time, effort, and resource around things like privacy, data security, et cetera. It's a big, it's sort of behind the scenes from a consumer point of view for the most part. They don't tend to focus on it as much. But as an entity, we focus on it a great deal. And I think all of our partners focus on that a great deal. I think that's actually a little bit of the, we were talking about hurdles to adoption. And some of the driving forces that we're seeing right now in the marketplace is if you are going to have a third party, a vendor like a Dario Health or Omada or whoever it is, that is helping your population, whether you're an employer or a health plan, it's incumbent on you to make sure that they're meeting those security standards, that they're meeting the privacy standards. And there's a lot of review and regulatory and compliance kinds of activities that happen, which makes it really expensive in a lot of cases to support vendors. And I think that what we're seeing is, and in some cases providers, I think we're seeing that start to push into bigger providers as well. And so what we're starting to see in the marketplace is people pushing for the idea of more conditions covered by less vendors. How can I consolidate my effort to do that? And as long as that happens, there will be, some obstruction to adopting things like digital health. I think that there's other things that are happening also, though, to standardize it, just like in other industries. So, high trust certification, which has got a broad-based understanding of what does that mean. It doesn't remove all of the cost associated with it, but it makes it significantly easier. It brings it to a standard framework of compliance and security that people can understand and how that works. But I think that, that trust, even when consumers don't necessarily think about it every day, if you break that trust, then that becomes a big deal. And people really focus on that, from that perspective. I will also throw in, though, one of the things that I think is interesting that you see is that some of this is generational too. So, the privacy element, I'll just talk about that, is, a big issue that we focus on a lot. But as you move into younger and younger populations, I've seen this over and over again, is that their need, desire, and want for privacy diminishes relative to those of us who are a little bit older. As it relates to that. So I think that we're going to see changes in that as well. And it shows up in some kind of interesting areas, including things like, am I willing to share my experiences with others? Yeah. And, there is some evidence around things like communities and things like that that can really support people with different kinds of disease states and conditions, especially chronic conditions or, things like cancer, et cetera. And I think that we're going to see more and more contribution by people into the general support element over time as the population gets younger and younger, or the current young population, maybe I should say it this way, ages into having these issues, right? Because they're obviously far more prevalent in older populations.
So that and I just took the DIME ethics in digital medicine course, so it's all fresh in my mind. But I mean, we're not talking about total privacy of data, because then we don't necessarily have access to all those things you're talking about, and analytics and whatnot. We're talking about the right to choose, and transparency around how an individual's data will be used. And that's really, I think, where this industry can lead, is in saying, how do you want us to use this data? And I think that's where the ethics comes in. That really struck me as kind of a shift in tone in a way, right? Because we don't read the fine print, but we really are, potentially opening ourselves up to major trust issues if we don't. So let's see here. Coming back to the questions here.
I might just pick up on one or two, points in the chat just to build on those themes, because I think there's a question about, like, an example of a barrier, right, that's being experienced at maybe a more tangible example, let's say at a payer level. And I might just do a compare and contrast to the pharmaceutical side of the business. Right now, pharmaceuticals have been around for many decades, and so there's maturity, right? So, and what do I mean when I'm talking about maturity? What I mean is, like, we know who the decision makers are. We know what the process is going to be for evaluation. We know what the standards, generally speaking, are going to be for evaluation and for setting a price point. We know how contracting works. We know how we're going to drive implementation and operationalization, right? And that maturity, I think we could all envisage will come, but we don't have that maturity universally today in the payer landscape, right? And so the fact that it's a learning curve with every payer, and that there's not necessarily like universal standards, which means, you're trying to meet and understand and meet the needs of the payer, but you have to do it a little bit, uniquely to each of the payer needs. That's different, I think, to a very mature segment where the methodology of evaluation, decision-making, process timelines, et cetera, are all defined. And I call that out as an example because I think that's critical for scaling and, scaling of an industry to really have the maximum benefit that it can be, right? And so I just give that as a compare and contrast. I hope that's sort of a useful example. Now, I think we've also sort of touched on that in this whole equation, data is important, and we talk about the risk side of data. Maybe we talk about, like, what's going to drive that trust equation. I noticed another comment in the chat, which I think is interesting. Maybe Lynette and Rick, you give perspectives about, like, does FDA validation give greater trust and confidence or not? And I guess I'll just share some starting thoughts. Firstly, I think there's unquestionably a place for regulation, and where regulation steps in and defines an accepted standard, I think that is, for a certain category of innovations, extremely valuable. If I sort of break down, like, at least the lens through which we're thinking about digital interventions, we're thinking about things that help one optimize their health and well-being, right? So some of the more lifestyle-driven pieces of the puzzle, and those don't need heavy regulation. We think about interventions that are helping people manage their own disease. So give me the tools and the power to do what I can do for my own health by my own choice. some parts of that require regulation and some parts of that don't require regulation. And then we get over into a segment where we would say, let's use digital as an innovation platform in order to treat disease. And now all of a sudden we need a healthcare professional involved because this is actual treatment. I think once we get over to that right side and where we're getting much closer to prescription digital therapeutics, there's a very clear benefit to having a defined regulatory framework, as we're seeing, and some very positive policy evolution that is going to hopefully accelerate the maturation of that segment. So I do think that there certainly is a place for the regulator bringing increased confidence and certainty in some parts of the innovation of this segment. But, fundamentally, what digital can do is so broad that I don't think the regulator has to, and I don't think the regulator thinks this either, they don't have to regulate every part of it. So we're still left with this important need to prove benefit with or without validation by the FDA. There would be some starting thematics, at least, I would pick up. I don't know, Lynette or Rick, if you might have different or similar views.
I think about this a lot, Rick. I'll let you jump in after, but our group just did a big project in collaboration with the FDA on navigating the regulatory pathways for digital medicine, and there are pathways, and it's hard to sort of stay ahead of how quickly this field is moving. And like you said, if it's a therapeutic, it's obviously regulated, but then the FDA really regulates risk. And where there is a clinical risk. Now, I've been asked, well, is virtual care regulated? Well, it's healthcare, and the FDA doesn't regulate healthcare delivery. So when we start to look at coaching apps or various different ways, like you said, to help patients build the skills to manage their COPD or whatever it is, how do we start to trust those? Because the FDA is not touching that. Well, the CMS doesn't regulate. Do we have a code? Well, that means if you get a code, it may mean you've got a lot of evidence that you've submitted. It takes a long time, and the codes are way behind the type of care that's being delivered. So, we're all trying to rush to figure out where are those standards. And I think that some of the leading health systems, providers such as Dario and some of our really innovative payers are leaning in to, like you said, try to develop their own evidence bar for how are we going to regulate, or how are we going to pay for digital therapeutics. When I talked to one of the Blues plans, it was first to announce they're going to pay for it. Said, yeah, we announced our intent, but now we have to figure out operationally what is part of a program, because we don't want to just have one more device or product on the market that we pay for. We want to figure out what goes into a trustworthy program. And so working with the vendors, I'm seeing a lot more collaboration around the evidence generation with payers, with employers, and health systems, rather than throwing a dossier of value over the fence. It's a much more, there's a lot of questions in the chat about how does a startup get to this evidence level? And I think it's a process. As soon as you're treating patients, you're collecting data, and then you move, with your partners along. But Rick, actually, your team has done an incredible job of the evidence generation and really setting the standards, I think, for what kind of studies and what's sort of the bar for real outcomes. I don't know if you want to pile on there.
Yeah, no, I mean, what I would add, especially, to the question of, how does a smaller, earlier company get to that kind of data? And, I have an old joke that it takes about 18 months to get 12 months worth of data, especially if you're working with a health plan. But, I think a lot of it is, and we're starting to see this more. I mean, Dario Health is unique in the fact that we went direct to consumer first, when most digital health companies of its age were going directly to payers and employers, as their starting point. And I think that we're seeing more and more, Andreessen came out with something, where they were talking about urging their startup companies to go direct to consumer first. And I think there are some real benefits to that, which include the ability to generate data. I mean, our direct consumer business, several years ago was generating over 5 billion data points a year. Now we use that to help with personalization, but then, as you mentioned, I mean, we now have, north of 40 studies. that are showing the clinical outcomes across the platform. And, some of those, the advantage to going that direction is you can get really large data sets. I mean, 35, 40,000 people in a study. You can look at it longitudinally over a long period of time, 1, 2, 3, 4 years. But it still takes the time to generate that. So you have to have sort of this mix of ability and willingness to stick in that. And I think that, that is a barrier. I mean, we keep coming back to some of the barriers, but, there is a barrier to having the ability to go that direction first. I think the other advantage above and beyond the data and being able to demonstrate outcomes is that it enables you to have that one-on-one relationship with the person that's using your product, and what do they respond to and what don't they. As we've moved more into, selling into what we would call the B2B space, we keep our B2C business. And one of the reasons we keep that business is because there is nothing that will replace that DNA that's within Dario and the ability to go to our, consumer base and say, hey, we have an idea. What do you think of it? And, sometimes they don't think much of it. And, that's the place to figure that out. And sometimes, it really takes off. And that gives you that ability to build product at that level where you can really put something in front of somebody and let them be essentially your product manager, if you think about it. And when you're talking about how do we get people to engage, because it always comes back full circle to that, is, things that provide value is what creates habits and has people come back and do those things. So understanding what they respond to is very important. But I think that the short answer is the way you get to that data, the way you be able to show those studies is you go find populations, and sometimes you're going to have to find funding sources to be able to enable you to get to those sources, and then really start to generate the data on how they respond. And then over a period of time, and I think we're seeing this more and more, the rigor has started to go up. So, if you start in digital health 10 years ago, the level of rigor was low. Now it's starting to increase, and legitimately so, because I think we've got better abilities as an industry to be able to do that. So, there is definitely a hurdle to overcome, but I think consumers is the way to go to get data fast, or faster.
And, you sort of brought me around to the direct consumer first. It means that you're designing your products with the patient experience in mind from the very get-go. It's, and all the different populations that you want to engage, you're designing it with satisfaction and experience in mind, which is not how we do healthcare. So I think that sort of satisfaction and experience, native experience is pretty valuable. Alex, thoughts on that? I mean, when I looked at in this workshop we just did, there were some questions. Well, how do you get comparator data? Because as you said, sort of the robustness is really changing. Well, you eventually, when you're mature enough, maybe you do a randomized control trial. But I'm seeing studies published that are very well designed, that are using in collaboration with maybe health plans that are using propensity matching. And, with statistics, we're starting to see some, I think, very robust comparative studies. So Alex, I know this is your world, in a way. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, I mean, let's separate. You've got a formal regulated pathway where you've got prescription digital therapeutics, and there are, there's greater clarity there. But I'm just going to come down into the less regulated segment and talk about that. And I mean, the first thing that jumps to mind for me is a formal randomized controlled trial makes sense when you have a single variable that you want to test, and everything else, as best you can be controlled, right? And that's the drug model, where you go, and do something very prospective and very formalized and very controlled. Of course, the drug model doesn't have the richness of data coming off it live to let you do something different. And so, I think some of the great questions that are coming up about, well, what is that standard going to look like, and how do you get that standard defined? I think we're certainly working with the Dario team to look at what are innovative approaches to lift the bar on how you demonstrate evidence. But that doesn't mean that you need to go into a formal prospective randomized study. And I think that I think that, as over the next sort of, 3 to 4 months, we'll be, releasing some new data. I think it's taken a very different methodology. It's getting closer to trying to work out how can you use existing data sources to give, credible control perspective on what the impact of what you're doing is. And I think that, as we get more and more innovation happening in terms of how we generate evidence, and I don't think that means following the drug game. I think that means resetting what is truly relevant and applicable to the intervention that we're looking at here. I think that opens the door. So I would sort of say we might have started with, basic retrospective data as a first entry point. We do need to certainly go further, and, that doesn't mean you need to go to the extreme of the pharmaceutical model. And, I think as we start to see richer and richer data coming out from lots of, players, I think that's going to define the bar per se. Then I guess there's, a related sort of question which comes up about, well, how do you get acceptance of that as being the appropriate sort of standard, right? And I think, Lynette, this is where I think like societies such as yours are really important, because it's understandable that the market environment we're in at the moment is not mature, and it needs to be shaped, and needs to be influenced, needs to be defined. There needs to be thought leadership that comes out and helps us. And I think that's part of what, efforts like yourself are doing, Lynette. I think it's part of why a company like Sanofi is stepping into digital healthcare to try and think about, is the moment right now where this industry can start to be matured and scaled? And if so, then, having a large corporate presence can help to educate and to infiltrate, let's say, common understanding or common definitions, even questions of definitions today, right, which are completely reasonable. I think that sort of emergence and maturity is starting to feel like now is the time, right? Now is the time when the technology's got to a point where it's mature, the policy environment is signaling favorability, the payer desirability is there, and there's the pull from the end consumer who you're trying to serve. And I think that's a good recipe to sort of say, okay, now's a nice time to really try and see us evolve and mature this segment.
I think that's a good segue. I mean, when we were preparing for this, we talked about, if the existing payment models aren't a perfect fit for what we're doing with digital, it doesn't account for coaching, doesn't account for asynchronous care, all the wraparound services that make the outcomes. How do we, design a payment or incentive model that works? And I see a lot in the work that I do at Dime of, so that blend of fee for service with outcomes milestones and virtual first care is, I think, just perfectly built for bundled type payments. And then we can start to look at risk sharing. And Rick, I know that you've been moving in this direction for a while, and I hear from other virtual first care companies that is where they want to go. They feel like they can get the outcomes, and it's just how do you design those payment models so they're not one-offs with every single health plan, or how do we start to shift that? And I really want to hear what you think, how we can move there.
Yeah, I mean, I think value-based care has a lot of promise, and I think that's why there's so much interest in value-based care. But value-based care means a lot of things to a lot of people, and it is a very complex area. So one area where that shows up, for example, and I spoke about this earlier, is we can track individual down to the level of how did they do, what were their improvements, and if you have the right partners at the table, you can look all the way through the claims data and costs, et cetera. You can look through clinical data and understand what those clinical improvements are that are both going to be with the digital health company as well as with the providers if you partner with the providers. Then the question actually goes to what Alex was talking about a little bit ago in terms of evidence and trials. Is one of the biggest questions is, what's the attribution? Okay, so you intervened with this patient and you provided some services. Was it what you were doing? Is it what somebody else was doing? Is it totally unrelated to those things? So I think it's a combination of, studies triangulating with individual level data. I don't think you can get to true value-based care without digital, because of the fact you can get down to that individual level. And I think we're going to see that revolution across things like medical devices also. It's not just like digital healthcare. It's, hey, are these medical devices having an impact? What sort of an impact are they having? And then I think that there's also how do the various different participants in the market work together? How does a digital health company work with a pharmaceutical company, work with a medical device company, bring those pieces together? And, I think that that's something that, Dario and Sanofi are looking at even outside of ourselves as we look at, who else can we bring into that collaboration? But I think there's places we can start. Having had the argument with actuaries over and over again in terms of attribution, we look to start with things like fees at risk, associated with predefined kinds of milestones, things like milestone-based billing, which is, achieve some, it really sort of started, I think, in the DPP space. Somebody probably correct me on that. But, we're seeing more and more interest in those kinds of approaches where it's like, show me that you've achieved something with a particular patient, and then I'm willing to pay for that. And in some cases, that's a fantastic model because they're willing to pay more because you've delivered an outcome, right? Now, it has positives and negatives. And I think as, folks, look at that, especially if you're talking about, companies that are younger companies to the market, that has, capital implications, cash flow implications, all kinds of other things that go into that. But I think as we get the evidence base better and better, we can fine tune those things and do it in a way that doesn't require that we go down to the nitty gritty of saying, okay, this is what the cost of the person was. This is how we're going to evaluate what that change is. And this is how we're going to, reimburse you for that, because that becomes a very complex problem, especially when you attach dollars to it. People get real specific real fast. And so you can do things that don't require that you go down to that level and argue about attribution, that really say, okay, with this patient, we were able to achieve X, and we believe in combination with the other evidence we have, X is a good thing through whoever's lens it is that you're working with, whether that's a better clinical outcome, whether that's a better cost outcome, whatever that case may be.
Thoughts on that, Alex? Want to pile in there?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, I very much agree with the thematics that Rick had shared. I think there's maybe I'm just trying to link it to some of the questions and comments in the chat, right? I think there's an interesting, like one of the latter questions that come up is an interesting question, like, should some of these interventions actually be reimbursed, right? I mean, should education be reimbursed? Should, tools to make your own health decisions be reimbursed? And I think I would answer it as in a very simple way, and sort of saying, if there's proof that it improves healthcare, then it has a role in the health expenditure that we invest in our communities. So I think the proof points are extremely important. We know that health is multifactorial. So we know that there's a role for formal provider systems. We know that there's a role for drugs and devices. There's also a role for digital to give people the ability to make better informed choices themselves when it is to a point of health literacy that they can make good decisions for themselves. And fundamentally, if we can do that, we can take pressure off the healthcare system, because people are engaging in the healthcare system when they really need it, and they're solving their own problems when they're able to solve their own problems. If you can prove that to an adequate standard, that it's hopefully more than cost neutral, but ideally, cost saving, which is clearly where I think we can all see the technology is able to get to, then I think that's innovation which deserves to be rewarded. And I think that I'm speaking as someone who is trying to drive adoption of those innovations, but I think our colleagues in the payer side, our colleagues in the provider system side would very much agree that all comes together. I think when I think about a company like Sanofi being in this space with a company like Dario, and like what does that end state look like? There's part of me which feels like there are two end states that you can imagine. There's an end state where on the intervention side, you've got drugs and you've got devices, and now we go and put a new set of interventions called digital into the mix. Or you can see a convergence of the three. And when you think about what's good for patients, when you think about what's good for the efficiency of the healthcare system, the convergence probably makes most sense. And then if you say, well, what's going to converge? Drug, device, digital is going to converge it, right? I mean, this I think is the power of digital to to be an enabler of connection and to make, fragmentation and complexity much more simplified and much more, serving of the people that we're actually trying to improve the health of. And I think that's a really important value proposition that I think we can all unite our innovative, efforts towards driving towards and knowing that we're doing something good and something that absolutely deserves to be rewarded through, through appropriate mechanisms. I think I just want to pick up on one more point if I can, Lynette, because I think it's a really important point, and I think it almost drops to the very first, comment that, as I've just been flicking through the chat, that I can see, which is this question of, is there a benefit in when we start to think about the social determinants of health? And I think the question pulls out a really important dichotomy, right? Which is, for those who have access to digital may be a solution which could address some of those, issues that we're familiar with. But what about those who don't? Doesn't this just add to the social divide? And I think firstly, if we deal with the first category, for people who are find it difficult to engage with healthcare systems, be that due to the hours that they work, the expense of the system, the accessibility of treatments in it, or physicians and carers in areas that they're at, digital broadens reach. And I think that's, of immense value. It lets you move from synchronous to asynchronous or synchronous. In other words, to do what is good for someone at the right time. And, brilliant technology platforms such as Dario also start to personalize. They start to understand the person, the individual. And the more you understand the individual, the more you give an individual experience. And that actually does address some of these barriers we're talking about. But I think that other side is really important to talk about. And it's one of I call it out because I think, Rick, this is one of the reasons we became, very deeply in conversation with Dario about, well, there are people who might have, I don't know, a very previous era phone, but they don't have internet, Wi-Fi or a 5G connection or 4G connection or whatever. And I think, great innovators such as Dario are still trying to find paths to meet those people's needs, right? So that you're not left with a complete void. And I don't know, Rick, I just call it out because I think it's an important topic for us to pick on, but maybe we touch on some of the thematics. What does Dario do in that sort of more view?
That was my question. I want to hear specifics.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
Well, no, and I appreciate you. That was one of the questions I wanted to get to as well. I think one of the things, just to differentiate real quickly between digital health and telehealth, is digital health doesn't require that you have a high-speed internet connection, and it doesn't require that it doesn't require a synchronous communication with a provider. So, they serve different but compatible purposes. So one of the things I think that, we really try and design around is the idea that I talked about earlier, which is one-to-many and personalization of consumption of information and help, if you will, like the various different interventions at the time somebody wants to be able to do that, and understanding that there may be, it's fantastic if you have a real-time connection, because sometimes the things we're doing are real time and we can send it to you real time. But we also see in our data that people access our software and our system periodically. And it would appear that they do that because you can collect other kinds of data, metadata around it, is they're doing it when they're on a Wi-Fi. So one can imagine somebody being able to come in and have free Wi-Fi and be able to connect to the internet, take down the information that they want, send out some of their information and communications, including chats with their coach if they want to. Even that is asynchronous through the application. There's other ways to do that, of course, SMS, et cetera. But it really enables maximizing the opportunities to let people engage and enroll, by the way, also, but really to engage with the system the way that they want to engage and the way that they can engage. So you can engage at 2 a.m, you can engage at 4:30 in the morning, you can engage at noon, right? All times, to Alex's point about, and we see that in different populations, and we can to some extent segment out those. And one of the things that we do is we personalize experience. So the platform looks at how people interact with it, including time, channel, and communication, and it will respond to them in those kinds of times. Now, is it going to be 100% perfect? No, nothing ever is going to be. But what we're trying to do is broaden the access. The other thing, I think, we have health plans in the Medicaid space. that are using the Dario solution. And one of the things that you find is sometimes we use digital medical device, or excuse me, cellular medical devices. But one of the things we try and do at Dario is drive everything through the phone. And if you look at the statistics and our experiences, there's actually what I think some people find a surprising number of both older population as well as populations that are socioeconomic, more on the bottom tiers, that actually have access to smartphones and things of that nature. Data, minutes tends to be a bigger issue, for example, than actual access to hardware. And, I credit some of the states for that too, because they put those, they have programs to put those phones out in these populations as well. So, nothing is going to solve all of these things, but it does enable you to personalize the experience, make it more accessible to people at different points in time, recognizing that access may be different. Maybe I'm going to, the local, Starbucks just to be able to sit, at a table and access their Wi-Fi, for example. And we have to design for that in the member experience part of the process. But we're trying to increase the number of people that can have access. It's not 100% perfect, but the other thing that I really like about what we're doing is we're trying to personalize it so that it does feel like it's a personalized experience for you, no matter what your method and approach is coming in. And I think that that's welcoming. I think that is engaging. And I think that that's what helps us with these populations where we are seeing very good results, by the way, also clinically.
Yeah, this is lovely. As you've been talking, I've been sort of checking off boxes in my head. To Alex's point, I mean, our role as a sort of third-party society is to try to document, well, what can you do? I'm looking at these questions, how important is it to address equity? How do you design with diversity, equity, inclusion in mind from the get-go? And it's, we've put out some resources. You can look on our website, that the collaboration with the FDA that do look at how do you, not just providing cellular rather than broadband needs, but how do you design with different cultures, languages, health literacy, right into your design specs from the beginning. And then how do you so from the design, and then from the deployment side, what are some of the things you need to think about? We've got lots of resources of checklists and ways to deploy these technologies, whether you're working with populations in a Medicaid health plan or direct to consumer or otherwise. All right, so this has been incredible. There are so many questions, and we won't be able to get to all of them, although I understand that this webinar is recorded, so you'll be able to forward this, all participants, to your teammates and other folks who might be interested. And I believe that we can funnel the questions out through the Dario team. Am I correct in that? Right, and
yeah.
Or we have some unanswered questions get back to you. I think that's it. Thank you, both Rick and Alex. This has been a lot of fun. I think we could go on for much longer, and I think that we are sort of over and out on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Dario Health and to everyone that joined us today. Please visit our website at hlth.com to catch up on all Health GoLIVE webinars. And join us in Nashville, March 26th through 29th for Vive 2023.